My name is Conrad Sullivan, and I am 68 years old. I found my only daughter dying in a cold hospital room in Los Angeles, with half her skull removed, while her husband was popping a $300 bottle of champagne on a yacht I paid for. He told his friends I was just a senile old man rotting away in a farmhouse in Ohio. He told his mistress that he would be $10 million richer by sunrise. He was wrong. He didn't know that the yacht he was standing on belonged to a shell company I owned. He didn't know I was recording every word he said. And he certainly didn't know that before the sun came up, I would turn his perfect life into a living hell so severe that prison would feel like a mercy. Before I tell you how I destroyed him, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. The nightmare began with a phone ring that shattered the silence of my farmhouse in Ohio at exactly 2:17 in the morning. I am a man who values sleep, but 40 years in the cutthroat world of industrial real estate had trained me to wake up instantly. I looked at the caller ID. It was not family. It was a number I did not recognize with a Los Angeles area code. My heart skipped a beat. My daughter Lily lived in Los Angeles. I answered with a gruff hello. A woman on the other end was speaking fast and her voice was shaking. She asked if I was Conrad Sullivan, the father of Lily Sullivan. I said yes. Then she dropped the bomb that stopped my world. She told me my daughter had been brought into the emergency room at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. She had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. She was unconscious. She was critical. And she was alone. I asked where her husband was. Where was Brett? The nurse hesitated. She said they had been trying to reach Mr. Walsh for 3 hours, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She said Lily needed emergency decompressive surgery immediately to relieve the pressure on her brain, but they needed a next of kin to authorize the risks. I felt a cold rage spread through my veins like ice water. I told her I authorized everything. Do whatever it takes to save her. I hung up and immediately dialed Brett. 1 time, 2 times, 12 times, straight to voicemail. This was the man who swore at the altar 3 years ago to protect my daughter with his life. Now she was dying, and he was ghosting her. I did not pack a bag. I did not brush my teeth. I walked out of my bedroom wearing my pajamas and a trench coat. I grabbed my black wallet from the nightstand. I drove my old Ford pickup truck at 90 miles an hour to the private airfield 20 minutes away. I made one call on the way to a charter company I had used in my past life. I told them I needed a Gulfstream ready on the tarmac in 15 minutes. The broker told me it would cost $45,000 for a one-way flight at this hour. I told him I didn't care if it cost $45 million. I wired the money before I even parked the truck. As I boarded the plane, the engines were already screaming. I looked down at my shaking hands. They weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking from a fury so dark it frightened me. I sat in the leather seat of that $45,000 flight, staring into the darkness, and I promised myself one thing. If Brett Walsh had hurt my daughter, he would wish he had never been born. I landed in Los Angeles just as the first hint of gray was touching the sky. A car was waiting to take me to Cedars-Sinai. I ran through the hospital corridors, ignoring the receptionist who tried to make me fill out paperwork. I found the intensive care unit, and then I saw her. My beautiful, vibrant Lily. She looked so small in that hospital bed. Half of her beautiful blonde hair had been shaved off. Her head was wrapped in thick white bandages stained with yellow antiseptic. Her face was swollen and bruised from the tubes running down her throat. The rhythmic beeping of the life support machines was the only sound in the room. It was the loneliest sound I had ever heard. I stood there gripping the metal rail of the bed, and a memory flashed through my mind. I remembered her wedding day 3 years ago. I remembered handing Brett a check for $2 million as a wedding gift. I told him it was seed money for his tech startup. I remembered handing him the keys to a $4.5 million villa in Malibu. I gave him everything because I wanted Lily to be happy. I wanted her to be safe. And now look at her. She was fighting for her life in a cold room without a single flower on the bedside table, without a hand to hold. The door opened and the lead neurosurgeon walked in. He looked exhausted. He looked at me and then at Lily. He asked if I was the father. I nodded. He told me the surgery went as well as expected, but the swelling was severe. Then he paused. He looked uncomfortable. He said there was something else I needed to know. He said that an hour ago, just before I arrived, they finally got a hold of her husband, Brett. I asked if he was on his way. The doctor shook his head. He said Brett had asked about the cost of the advanced neuromonitoring and the private recovery room. When he heard the price, he refused to authorize it. He told the hospital to put her in a shared ward because his insurance wouldn't cover the premium upgrades. He said it was a waste of money if she wasn't going to wake up. I felt the blood drain from my face. My daughter was lying there with her skull open, and her husband was pinching pennies. He was haggling over the price of her dignity. I pulled out my American Express Centurion card, the black card made of titanium. I handed it to the doctor. I told him to give her everything. The best room, the best monitoring, the best specialists. I told him money was not an object. I told him I would buy this entire hospital if I had to. The doctor took the card and nodded. Then he lowered his voice. He leaned in closer to me. He said, "Mr. Sullivan, there is something else. We ran a toxicology screen when she arrived. It is standard procedure for a stroke in a young woman. We found high levels of a sedative in her blood, a powerful benzodiazepine. Does your daughter have a history of anxiety or insomnia?" I looked at him straight in the eye. I told him absolutely not. Lily was a yoga instructor. She was a health fanatic. She didn't even take aspirin for a headache. She drank green juice and meditated. She would never touch heavy sedatives. The doctor nodded slowly. He said the levels were consistent with chronic ingestion over several months. He said it could explain the spike in blood pressure that caused the hemorrhage. It was a drug interaction. My mind started racing. Someone had been drugging my daughter. Someone had been weakening her vessels day by day. And there was only one person who made her coffee every morning. There was only one person who had access to her every single day. I walked out of the room because I felt like I was going to explode. I needed air. I needed answers. I pulled out my phone and called Cole. Cole was an ex-FBI agent I kept on retainer for my business dealings. He was expensive, but he could find a needle in a haystack in 10 minutes. I told him I needed to find Brett Walsh. I needed to know where he was right now. Cole told me to give him 2 minutes. While I waited, I opened the tracking app on my phone. 3 years ago, I had bought Lily a Porsche 911 GT3, a beautiful machine. Brett drove it more than she did. I had installed a high-end GPS tracker in the chassis, not to spy on them, but for security in case of theft. I opened the app. The blue dot blinked on the map. It wasn't at their home in Malibu. It wasn't at his office. It was at the Marina del Rey. My phone buzzed. It was Cole. He sent me a link to an Instagram story. It was posted 20 minutes ago by a woman named Vanessa. She was a 22-year-old swimsuit model. The video showed a man from the back, but I recognized the expensive Italian jacket. I recognized the watch I gave him for Christmas. It was Brett. He was standing on the deck of a yacht, holding a bottle of Dom Perignon. The caption on the video read, "Celebrating Freedom." The location tag was the Azure Dream. My blood ran cold. The Azure Dream was a $12 million super yacht. Brett loved to show it off to his friends. He told everyone he bought it after his company went public. But that was a lie. The yacht belonged to CS Holdings, and CS Holdings was a shell company owned 100% by me, Conrad Sullivan. He was partying on my boat, while my daughter was dying in my hospital room. I did not call the police. The police would ask questions. They would file reports. They would take months. I didn't have months. I didn't even have hours. I left the hospital and hailed a cab. I looked down at my clothes. I was still wearing my old flannel pajama top, tucked into a pair of wrinkled khaki trousers and a trench coat. I looked like a homeless man or a senile grandfather who had wandered away from a nursing home. Good. That was exactly what I wanted him to see. I wanted him to underestimate me one last time. The drive to the marina took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of pure, calculated hatred. I arrived at the dock. The Azure Dream was lit up like a Christmas tree. I could hear the thumping bass of house music from the parking lot. I walked past the security gate. The guard tried to stop me. He looked at my clothes and told me this was a private dock. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I simply dialed the number of my attorney, Liam O'Malley. Liam was the kind of lawyer who scared other lawyers. I put him on speakerphone. Liam told the guard that if he didn't open the gate in 3 seconds, he would have his badge, his job, and his pension by morning. The gate opened. I walked down the dock. The sea air was salty and cold. I saw the yacht. There were people dancing on the upper deck. I saw waiters serving caviar. I saw women in bikinis despite the chill. And there in the center of it all was Brett. He was laughing. He was throwing his head back and laughing while holding that model Vanessa by the waist. I wanted to march up the gangway and throw him into the dark water. I wanted to wrap my hands around his throat and squeeze until the laughing stopped. But I stopped myself. I took a deep breath. Emotion is the enemy of strategy. That is what I taught my executives for 40 years. If I went up there now and caused a scene, he would play the victim. He would say he didn't know. He would say he was grieving in his own way. I needed more. I needed a confession. I knew this boat better than he did. I had designed the layout. I knew there was a service entrance near the stern used by the crew. I slipped past the partygoers. No one noticed the old man in the trench coat in the shadows. I found the captain. His name was Marco. He had been on my payroll for 20 years. When Marco saw me, he almost dropped his tray. He started to speak, but I put a finger to my lips. I signaled him to stay silent. I pointed to the bar on the lower deck. He nodded and unlocked the service door for me. I crept inside. The music was muffled here. I positioned myself behind the partition of the VIP lounge bar. It was dark. I waited. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Brett walked in with Vanessa. They were stumbling a little. They were drunk. They sat down on the white leather sofa just 3 feet away from where I was crouching. I pulled out my phone and hit record. Brett sighed contentedly. He poured another drink. Vanessa giggled and asked him if he was worried about his wife. She asked if he should maybe go to the hospital. Brett laughed. It was a cold, cruel sound. He said, "Why should I go? The doctor said she's practically a vegetable. She isn't going to make it through the night. And even if she does, she won't be able to talk. She won't remember anything." Vanessa asked him about the money. She asked what would happen to the house. Brett clinked his glass against hers. He said, "Baby, the house is just the beginning. She has a $10 million life insurance policy. And the best part is, the beneficiary hasn't been updated since we got married. It all comes to me. By next week, the money hits my account. And that old fool Conrad in Ohio, he won't suspect a thing. I'll tell him it was a tragic natural cause, a stroke. He's so old and out of it, he'll believe whatever I say. He'll probably thank me for organizing the funeral." Then he said the words that sealed his fate. He lowered his voice and said it took 3 months of switching those damn blood pressure pills for uppers and sedatives, but it finally paid off. She's gone, Vanessa, and we are free. I pressed stop on the recording. My hand was gripping the phone so hard that my knuckles were white. I looked down and saw a drop of blood on the floor. I had dug my fingernails into my own palm until I broke the skin. I had the confession. I had the proof of murder. I waited for them to leave the lounge to go back to the party. I slipped out the service door. I walked back down the dock alone. I sat in the back of a cab and watched the lights of the marina fade away. I didn't call the police, not yet. Prison was too good for him. Prison gives you 3 meals a day and a roof over your head. I wanted him to feel what it was like to have nothing. I wanted him to feel the panic of a rat when the water starts rising. I dialed Liam O'Malley again. It was 4 a.m. He answered on the first ring. I told him to initiate Protocol Omega. I told him I wanted every asset frozen. I wanted every loan called in. I wanted every credit card declined. I wanted Brett Walsh to be homeless, penniless, and insane before the handcuffs ever touched his wrists. My phone lit up with a text from the hospital. Lily was out of surgery. She was alive but still in a coma. I looked at the message and then I looked at the video file of Brett laughing on my yacht. The sun was coming up over Los Angeles. It was going to be a beautiful day for a funeral, but not for my daughter. The funeral would be for Brett Walsh's life, and I was going to be the one holding the shovel. I stepped out of the car at the entrance of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The air in Los Angeles was heavy and smelled of exhaust fumes and dust, but inside the hospital it smelled of antiseptic and cold indifference. I walked past the reception desk, ignoring the security guard who tried to ask for my identification. My eyes were fixed on the signs pointing to the intensive care unit. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I finally found room 304, the silence hit me harder than the noise of the jet engines. It was a sterile, suffocating silence. There she was. My Lily. The little girl who used to run into my arms with muddy knees was now lying in a bed that looked entirely too big for her. They had shaved the left side of her head. Her beautiful golden hair was gone, replaced by angry red incision marks and thick white bandages that smelled of iodine. Wires snaked out from under the sheets, connecting her to a parliule of monitors that flashed green and red in the dim light. A ventilator tube was taped to her mouth, forcing air into her lungs with a mechanical hiss that sounded like a snake coiling in the corner of the room. I walked to the bedside and my knees almost gave out. She looked so fragile. Her skin was the color of old paper, and her lips were cracked and blue. I looked around the room, expecting to see a coat on the chair, or a coffee cup on the table, or even a cheap bouquet of supermarket flowers. But there was nothing. No Brett. No friends. No one. She was dying in a room that felt like a storage closet. The chair beside her bed was pushed in perfectly against the wall. No one had sat there for a long time. I reached out and touched her hand. It was ice cold. As I held her limp fingers, a memory washed over me so vivid it made me nauseous. I was standing in the rose garden of my estate 3 years ago. Lily was in her white lace dress, looking like an angel. Brett was standing there in a custom tuxedo I had paid for. I remembered shaking his hand. I remembered pulling the thick envelope from my jacket pocket. It contained a cashier's check for $2 million. I told him, "Take this, Brett. Build a future for her. Build a life where she never has to worry about a single thing." He had looked me in the eye with that charming smile and promised he would treat her like a queen. $2 million. I bought him a career. I bought him a reputation. And now my daughter was lying here alone with half her head shaved, and he wasn't even man enough to sit in the chair next to her. The door swished open behind me. I turned around to see a man in blue scrubs entering the room. He looked exhausted. His name badge read, Dr. Aris, lead neurosurgeon. He didn't smile. He looked at the chart at the end of the bed, and then he looked at me. He asked if I was Mr. Sullivan. I nodded, unable to speak. He took a deep breath and told me the situation was deteriorating faster than they anticipated. The pressure inside her skull was critical. They needed to perform a decompressive craniectomy immediately to give the brain room to swell, or she would be brain dead within the hour. I told him to do it. I told him to cut whatever he needed to cut to save my girl. But the doctor didn't move. He looked down at a tablet in his hands and hesitated. He shifted his weight uncomfortably. He said, "Mr. Sullivan, there is an administrative issue. We received an email 10 minutes ago from her husband, Mr. Walsh. We had sent him the authorization forms for the advanced neurosurgical package, which includes the top-tier monitoring and the specialized post-op recovery team. It is the best chance she has." The doctor paused and tapped the screen. He said Mr. Walsh declined the package. He stated in writing that the insurance policy does not cover elective upgrades and that the standard procedure should be sufficient. He literally wrote that the cost-benefit analysis did not justify the expense. I felt the room spin. Sufficient. Cost-benefit analysis. He was bargaining with my daughter's life over an insurance deductible while sitting on a pile of my money. The rage that exploded in my chest was so hot, I thought it would melt the monitors. I looked at the doctor and saw the pity in his eyes. He thought I was just a helpless father caught in a bureaucratic nightmare. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He had no idea that I was about to rewrite the definition of sufficient. I snatched the clipboard from the trembling administrator's hands. She was stammering about insurance caps and policy limits, trying to explain why my daughter was being denied life-saving care. I didn't want to hear it. I pulled my American Express Centurion card from my wallet and slapped it onto the counter with a metallic clatter that echoed in the quiet hallway. I told her to charge the full $150,000 immediately. I told her that if my daughter needed a golden scalpel to survive, I would buy the gold mine myself. The woman nodded her eyes wide with fear and hurried away to process the payment, leaving me alone with the lead surgeon. Dr. Aris didn't leave. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He glanced at the nurse's station to ensure no one was listening before he spoke. "Mr. Sullivan, there is something else you need to know. We ran a comprehensive toxicology screen when she was admitted, which is standard protocol for a stroke in a 32-year-old woman. We found alarming concentrations of a powerful sedative in her system. It is a specific type of benzodiazepine usually reserved for severe psychiatric episodes or anesthesia." He paused and looked me dead in the eye. "Does your daughter have a history of clinical depression or suicidal ideation?" I felt a cold shiver run down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Absolutely not. Lily was the most vibrant person I knew. She was a yoga instructor who drank kale smoothies and meditated at sunrise. She treated her body like a temple. She wouldn't take a sleeping pill if her life depended on it, let alone a heavy antipsychotic drug. I looked at the doctor and told him my daughter didn't have a history of depression, but she did have a husband who had just refused to pay for her surgery. The realization hit us both at the same time. She wasn't just sick. She was being poisoned. The look on the doctor's face told me he had suspected the exact same thing, but was too afraid to say it out loud without confirmation. He nodded grimly and turned back into the operating room to try and save her life. I walked out of the ICU into the sterile brightness of the hallway. My hands were not shaking anymore. They were steady. The grief was temporarily pushed aside, replaced by a cold, calculating need for vengeance. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. Cole. He was a former FBI special agent who now ran the most discreet private investigation firm in the country. He answered on the first ring. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed a full forensic audit on Brett Walsh immediately. I wanted his phone records, his bank statements, and his location history. I wanted to know what he ate for breakfast and who he was talking to. Cole simply said, "Consider it done." I hung up and opened the vehicle tracking app on my phone. 3 years ago, I had given Lily a Porsche 911 GT3 as a birthday gift. It was her dream car, but she rarely drove it because she was afraid of scratching the paint. Brett, however, drove it like he owned it. I watched the screen as the satellite locked onto the signal. The blue dot wasn't at their house in the Hollywood Hills. It wasn't at his office downtown. It was parked at the Marina del Rey, the exact location of the yacht club. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't rushing to the hospital. He was at the marina, likely staring at the ocean, while his wife fought for every breath. I gripped the phone and started walking toward the exit. It was time to pay my son-in-law a visit. The drive to Marina del Rey was a blur of streetlights and fury. When I pulled my truck into the parking lot, the first thing I saw was the Porsche, my daughter's Porsche 911 GT3, parked haphazardly across two spaces like a discarded toy. Seeing it there gathering sea mist while its owner lay fighting for her life in a sterile hospital room made my stomach turn. I walked toward the slip where the Azure Dream was docked. The night air was thick with the smell of salt water and jasmine, but as I got closer, another smell took over. Expensive cigar smoke and the sickly sweet scent of excess. The yacht was impossible to miss. It was lit up like a floating nightclub amidst the dark, quiet hulls of the neighboring boats. The bass from the sound system thumped against my chest, a rhythmic insult to the gravity of the night. I stood in the shadows of the pier, pulling my trench coat tighter around my pajamas, watching the spectacle. There were at least 20 people on board. Young, beautiful people drinking my liquor and dancing on my teak decks. And there, in the center of it all, holding court like a king on his throne, was Brett. He looked impeccable. He wasn't wearing the wrinkled clothes of a worried husband. He was wearing a white linen suit that probably cost more than the nurse's annual salary at the hospital. He was holding a magnum of Dom Perignon in one hand and a woman in the other. I recognized her from the Instagram story Cole had sent me. Vanessa. She was draped over him, laughing at everything he said, her hand resting possessively on his chest. Brett shook the bottle and popped the cork, spraying $300 worth of champagne into the night sky while his sycophants cheered. To them, he was the generous host. To me, he was a parasite feeding on the carcass of my family. My vision blurred with red. For a moment, the strategist in me vanished, and I was just a father. I wanted to storm up that gangway. I wanted to tear that suit off his body and beat him until he couldn't stand. I wanted to scream the truth into his face until his arrogance shattered. I took a step forward, my hands clenching into fists so tight my fingernails bit into my palms. But then I stopped. I froze. If I went up there now, I would just be a crazy old man crashing a party. He would spin it. He would say he was blowing off steam. He would say I was unstable. He would play the victim and walk away with half my fortune. No. I forced myself to step back into the shadows. I needed more than a scene. I needed a confession. I needed undeniable proof that would not only divorce him from my daughter, but bury him under a mountain of criminal charges. I knew this boat better than he did. I had commissioned it. I walked quietly along the dock away from the main boarding ramp to the service entrance near the stern. It was locked. I knocked 3 times a specific rhythm. A moment later, the heavy steel door creaked open. Marco, the captain, stood there. He looked tired and annoyed until his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he saw my face. He started to stammer an apology, but I silenced him with a sharp look. I slipped past him into the quiet hum of the engine room. I was on board, and the wolf was now inside the fold. I crouched in the narrow space between the ice maker and the wall, breathing in the stale air of the lower deck. The heavy bass from the party above was just a dull throb here, vibrating against the mahogany paneling. I knew exactly where they would go. The VIP lounge behind the main salon was soundproofed and stocked with the rarest scotches in my collection. It was the place for secrets. A moment later, the door burst open. Laughter spilled into the room, harsh and jagged. I recognized the voices immediately. Brett and Vanessa. They stumbled in the smell of champagne and expensive perfume preceding them like a toxic cloud. They flopped onto the white leather sofas just 5 feet away from where I was hiding. I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed record, my hand steady as a surgeon's. Brett let out a long, exaggerated sigh of satisfaction. He poured a drink, the ice clinking against the crystal glass. He told Vanessa to relax because tonight was the night everything changed. She giggled and asked him if he was sure. She asked if he was worried the doctors might save her. Brett laughed, a sound that curdled the blood in my veins. He said, "Save her. Babe, there is nothing left to save. The doctors said her brain is swelling like a balloon. She is done. By sunrise, I will be a widower, and by next Friday, I will be $10 million richer." My breath caught in my throat. $10 million. That was the value of the life insurance policy I had taken out for Lily when she turned 25. I had forgotten about it, but Brett obviously hadn't. He had been counting down the days. Vanessa asked him about me. She asked what about her father, that old guy in Ohio. Brett scoffed. He called me a senile old fool who was probably asleep in his rocking chair right now. He said I wouldn't suspect a thing because the autopsy would just show a tragic natural stroke. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. He said it was the perfect crime. He bragged about how patient he had been. He told her about the pills. He said, "For 3 months I have been crushing up those heavy sedatives and mixing them into her blood pressure capsules. Every single morning I made her coffee and handed her death in a little plastic cup. She thanked me for it. She told me I was the best husband in the world, while I was slowly shutting down her organs." The rage that filled me was white-hot and blinding. He hadn't just neglected her. He hadn't just cheated on her. He had systematically murdered her over 90 days while smiling in her face. I looked down at my hand gripping the sharp metal edge of the counter. I was squeezing so hard that my fingernail had snapped and dug deep into the flesh of my palm. A single drop of dark red blood welled up and dripped onto the floor. I watched it fall, a silent period, at the end of his sentence. I had the recording. I had the confession. I had the motive. I didn't need to hear another word. I needed to get out of there before I killed him with my bare hands, because death was too easy for Brett Walsh. He needed to suffer. I slipped back out through the service door and into the cool night air, leaving the stench of champagne and betrayal behind me. The bass from the party thumped against my back, a rhythmic mockery of the tragedy unfolding in the hospital. I stood alone on the dark pier, my thumb hovering over the emergency dialer on my phone. It would be so easy to call the police right now. Sirens would wail. Handcuffs would snap. Justice would be swift. But as I looked at the silhouette of the yacht against the skyline, I realized that prison was too civilized for a man like Brett Walsh. Prison provided a bed. It provided meals. It provided a routine. I didn't want him to have a routine. I wanted him to have chaos. I wanted him to feel the ground open up and swallow him whole. I wanted him to experience the absolute terror of losing everything before the cell door even slammed shut. I put the phone to my ear and dialed Liam O'Malley. It was 4:17 in the morning. Liam was a shark in a suit, a lawyer who slept 3 hours a night and ate conflict for breakfast. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and alert, because he knew that a call from my private line at this hour meant either a catastrophe or a fortune. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I simply said, "Liam, initiate Protocol Omega." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Even a man as ruthless as Liam paused. He asked me if I was absolutely certain. He reminded me that Protocol Omega was a scorched earth strategy we had designed for hostile corporate takeovers, not for family members. It was a nuclear option designed to strip a target of liquid assets, credit, and legal standing simultaneously. I looked at the yacht where my son-in-law was celebrating my daughter's murder. I told Liam that Brett Walsh was not family. He was a parasite, and I was the exterminator. I gave him the instructions with a calm that terrified me. I told him to trigger the call clauses on the personal loans Brett had signed to fund his lifestyle. I told him to purchase the distressed debt of Brett's failing tech company, which I knew was secretly insolvent. I told him to freeze the discretionary accounts linked to the marriage trust. I wanted every credit card in his wallet to be a worthless piece of plastic by sunrise. I wanted his key fob to his office to stop working by lunch. I wanted him to look at his bank account and see a void so deep it would make him dizzy. Liam finally understood. He said he would wake up the partners and start the paperwork immediately. Just as I ended the call, the screen of my phone lit up with a notification from Cedars-Sinai. It was a text message from Dr. Eris. The surgery was over. The message read, "Decompressive craniectomy successful. Intracranial pressure has stabilized. She is alive but remains in a medically induced coma. The next 24 hours are critical." I stared at the glowing words and let out a breath I had been holding for 3 hours. She was alive. My little girl was fighting. She was holding on. And while she fought for her life in that silent white room, I was going to wage a war of my own. I looked back at the yacht one last time. Brett was still up there laughing, thinking he had won the lottery. He had no idea that the check was about to bounce. The sun was starting to bleed into the horizon. It was morning, and the hunt had officially begun. The sun had not yet risen when I walked into the conference room of O'Malley and Associates in Century City. It was exactly 5 in the morning. The city of Los Angeles was just a grid of amber lights below us, sprawling and indifferent. Liam O'Malley was already there, sitting at a mahogany table that was covered in stacks of legal documents and financial ledgers. He looked fresh, as if he hadn't just been woken up an hour ago. That was why I paid him $700 an hour. He pushed a cup of black coffee toward me and tapped the thickest file with his gold pen. We began the autopsy of Brett Walsh's life. To the outside world, Brett was a self-made tech mogul. He lived in a $4.5 million beachfront villa in Malibu. He drove a fleet of German sports cars. He captained a yacht on the weekends. He projected the image of a man who had conquered the world. But as Liam flipped through the pages, the truth was laid bare in black and white. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of my generosity and his own staggering arrogance. Liam pointed to the deed of the Malibu house. Brett liked to tell his friends he bought it with the profits from his Series A funding round. The reality was much more embarrassing. The house was owned entirely by the Lily Sullivan Revocable Trust. I was the sole trustee. Brett had signed a spousal occupancy agreement 3 years ago. He probably didn't even read it. He saw the ocean view and the infinity pool and signed his name on the dotted line. Legally, he wasn't the owner. He was a tenant, and tenants can be evicted. We moved on to the cars. The Porsche 911, the Range Rover, the vintage Jaguar. All of them were leased through a shell corporation I had set up to manage family assets. Brett didn't own the steering wheels, let alone the engines. He was driving borrowed metal. It was almost pathetic how easy this was. He had spent 3 years strutting around like a peacock in feathers I had bought him, never realizing that I could pluck them out whenever I chose. He had mistaken access for ownership. He thought because he held the keys, he held the power. He was about to learn the difference. Then we got to the ugly part. His company, TechWave. Brett told Lily the company was profitable. He told me they were preparing for an IPO. The financials told a different story. The company was bleeding cash. He was burning $200,000 a month on client dinners, private jets, and marketing hype, while the product itself was vaporware. He had taken out massive loans to keep the lights on. He owed $8 million to 3 different venture debt firms. The loans were toxic, high interest, short terms, and they were secured by his personal guarantee. I looked at the balance sheet. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But to me it looked like a weapon. I looked at Liam and gave the order that would end Brett's career. I told him to call the bank that held the primary debt. I told him I wanted to buy the note. I wanted to purchase the entirety of TechWave's debt immediately. I didn't care about the premium. I didn't care about the fees. I wanted to become his creditor. Because when you own a man's debt, you own his future. I wanted to be the one who made the call when the payment was due. Liam smiled a shark smile and picked up the phone. The sun was breaking over the horizon now, illuminating the city where Brett Walsh was currently sleeping off a hangover, thinking he was a king. He didn't know that the bank had just changed owners, and the new owner was coming to collect. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning when the elevator doors at the end of the intensive care unit hallway slid open. I was sitting in a hard plastic chair in the far corner of the waiting room, purposely positioning myself in the shadows. I had taken off my trench coat and unbuttoned the top of my flannel pajama shirt to look disheveled. I let my shoulders slump forward and practiced a slight tremor in my hands. I needed to look like a man who had been broken by grief, not a man who had just spent the last 3 hours with a shark lawyer buying $8 million of bad debt. I needed to look like prey. Then he appeared. Brett Walsh. He walked onto the floor with the slow, heavy steps of a grieving husband, but I knew better. I saw the way his eyes darted around the room, checking to see who was watching, before he fully committed to the act. He was wearing the same white linen suit from the Yacht, but it was rumpled now. He had clearly tried to clean himself up, but he couldn't wash away the look of a hangover. He reeked of strong mints, a desperate attempt to cover the stale smell of bourbon and cigars. In his left hand, he clutched a pathetic bouquet of dyed carnations wrapped in crinkly plastic. I recognized the price tag sticker from a 24-hour gas station. $7.99. He had spent $300 on a bottle of champagne to celebrate her death, but couldn't be bothered to spend more than $10 on flowers for her bedside. He walked up to the nurse's station and put on a performance that made my stomach turn. He leaned heavily against the counter, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with exaggerated sobs. I watched as he wiped away imaginary tears and grabbed the hand of the head nurse, pleading for an update, his voice cracking perfectly on the last syllable. The nurses looked at him with pity. They saw a young man shattered by a sudden tragedy. They saw a widower in the making. I saw a sociopath checking his watch, wondering how long he had to keep this up before he could go cash the check. Then he turned and saw me. I didn't make eye contact immediately. I stared blankly at the linoleum floor, letting my mouth hang open slightly. I looked small. I looked frail. I watched through my peripheral vision as he assessed me. He didn't see the man who had crushed unions and negotiated billion-dollar contracts. He saw a senile old farmer from Ohio who probably didn't even know what day it was. I saw a flicker of relief cross his face, followed immediately by a look of arrogant disdain. He realized he didn't have to fight me. He thought he just had to manage me. He walked over to where I was sitting. He didn't rush. He took his time, strolling with the confidence of a man who thought the game was already over, and he was just waiting for the trophy presentation. He placed a hand on my shoulder. His palm was damp and cold. He squeezed a little too hard, a subtle display of dominance disguised as comfort. He knelt down on one knee so he was eye level with me. His eyes were clear and dry despite the performance at the desk. Up close, the smell of him was nauseating, a mix of stale alcohol and expensive cologne. He looked into my face, searching for any sign of suspicion or strength. I gave him none. I just looked at him with watery, tired eyes and let out a shaky breath. He smiled a sad, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. He thought he was comforting a sheep. He didn't know he was kneeling in front of a wolf. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that was supposed to be gentle but sounded like a hiss. He asked the question he had been waiting to ask all night. "Dad, how is she? Is it finally over?" I looked up at him through the haze of my performance, letting my lower lip tremble just enough to sell the lie. I cleared my throat, which felt like it was coated in ground glass. I told him the news that I knew would make his heart sing. I said, "Brett, the doctor just left. He said the swelling was catastrophic. He used the words irreversible cessation of brainstem function. She is gone, son. There is nothing left inside that shell but electricity and machines." I paused to wipe a very real tear from my eye, though it was born of rage, not resignation. I told him that I had made the decision. I told him that at 3 o'clock this afternoon we were going to pull the plug. I watched his face closely. I watched for the micro-expressions that 40 years of negotiating with liars had taught me to spot. For a split second, the mask slipped. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in an involuntary spasm of pure delight. His eyes widened slightly, not with shock, but with the adrenaline of a gambler who just hit the jackpot. He bit his inner lip to physically suppress the smile. He was doing the math in his head right there in front of me. $10 million in life insurance, $4 million in real estate, my entire empire. It was all falling into his lap. He composed himself quickly, pulling the mask of the grieving husband back into place. He squeezed my shoulder with that damp, clammy hand. He said, "Oh God, Dad, I am so sorry. This is a nightmare. But you are making the right choice. We have to be strong for her. We have to be brave. It is what Lily would have wanted. We shouldn't prolong her suffering. We need to let her go, let her fly." The audacity of this man telling me to let my daughter die while he was calculating how fast he could buy a new Ferrari was almost impressive in its depravity. He was practically vibrating with excitement, eager to get the inconvenient part over with so he could start spending. I nodded weakly, playing the part of the broken, defeated old man. I reached into my battered leather satchel and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. They were heavy-bound, with a serious-looking metal clip. I placed them on the small table between us with a thud. I told him, "I can't handle this, Brett. I am too old. I am too tired. The hospital needs signatures for the end-of-life procedure, and there are papers here regarding the estate and the company. I can't deal with the lawyers and the accounts anymore. I just want to go back to my farm in Ohio and bury my child. I want you to take over. I want you to handle the administration of CS Holdings. I want you to be the man of the house now." I pushed the stack toward him and offered him a heavy gold pen. I saw his eyes lock onto the top page. It was a standard transfer of administrative authority cover sheet. It looked like I was handing him the keys, prompts to the kingdom. What he didn't know was that buried underneath that cover sheet were the lethal documents Liam and I had drafted at dawn. There was an unconditional assumption of debt. There was a waiver of spousal immunity. There was a document that transferred his personal liability to the corporate debt I had just purchased. He saw a crown. I was handing him a noose. I looked him in the eye and said, "Just sign here, son. Take care of everything for me so I can grieve in peace." Brett gripped the heavy gold pen I offered him. It was a Mont Blanc, a gift I had given him when he opened his office 2 years ago. He held it with a casual arrogance that made my skin crawl. He didn't even put on his reading glasses. He didn't pause to scan the paragraphs of dense legal text. He just saw the words "transfer of authority" on the cover page, and his eyes glazed over with greed. He flipped the page. Scratch, flip, scratch, flip. The sound of the nib tearing across the paper was the only noise in the waiting room. To him, it was the sound of victory. To me, it was the sound of a guillotine blade being hoisted into position. He was moving so fast he didn't notice when the context of the documents shifted. He thought he was signing administrative forms to help a grieving father manage a hospital bill. He had no idea that page 4 was an unconditional personal guarantee. By placing his signature on that line, he was voluntarily assuming full personal liability for every cent of debt held by his failing company, TechWave. That $8 million black hole in his corporate balance sheet was no longer limited to the business entity. It was now attached to his social security number. It was attached to his personal bank accounts. It was attached to his future earnings. He was signing away his freedom, and he was doing it with a smile. Then came page 7. Liam had buried it masterfully under a stack of standard medical release forms. It looked like just another piece of hospital bureaucracy, a formality regarding next of kin status. In reality, it was a spousal asset waiver. It was a document that explicitly stated that in the event of Lily's incapacitation or death, Brett Walsh voluntarily relinquished any claim to her trust assets, her real estate holdings, and most importantly, her life insurance proceeds. He was signing a legal document that said, "I do not want the money." He signed it without blinking. He probably thought it was a validation form for the parking garage. He finished the last page and capped the pen with a satisfied click. He looked up at me, his face arranged in a mask of solemn duty. He said, "Don't worry about a thing, Dad. I will take care of the empire. I will make sure Lily's legacy is protected. I will handle the lawyers and the accountants, so you can just focus on saying goodbye." He reached out and squeezed my hand again. It took every ounce of my willpower not to break his fingers. I looked at him with watery eyes and said, "Thank you, son. I don't know what I would do without you. You are a good man." From the shadows of the hallway, Liam O'Malley stepped into the light. He had been standing there the whole time, acting as the silent witness required by law. He wasn't wearing his usual shark-like grin. His face was blank, professional, and terrifyingly cold. He walked over to the table and picked up the stack of documents. He didn't look at Brett as a person. He looked at him as a carcass that had just been stripped clean. He tapped the bottom of the papers against the table to straighten them, the sound sharp and final, like a gavel striking a block. Liam placed the documents into his leather briefcase and snapped the locks shut. He looked at Brett, and for a brief second, a small, chilling smile played on his lips. He said, "Thank you, Mr. Walsh. These documents are in perfect order. We will process them immediately. Enjoy your day." Brett stood up, smoothing his linen suit, oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own death warrant. He checked his watch and said he had to go handle some arrangements. I watched him walk away. He was a dead man walking. He just didn't know it yet. Brett didn't go home to grieve. He didn't go to the chapel to pray for his wife's soul. He walked out of the hospital with a bounce in his step that was sickening to witness. He jumped into the Porsche 911, my daughter's car, and tore out of the parking lot, leaving a cloud of exhaust in his wake. I watched the blue dot on my tracking app race across the city. He wasn't heading to his office to save his failing company. He was heading straight to Beverly Hills. He parked right in front of a high-end jewelry boutique on Rodeo Drive. A moment later, another dot joined him. Vanessa. She was waiting for him, probably eager to hear the good news that the obstacle known as my daughter was finally being removed. I switched apps on my phone to the secure banking portal for TechWave. As the newly minted majority debt holder, I now had administrator access to every single financial instrument attached to the company, including the corporate credit lines. I could see the real-time transaction data. I watched as the authorization request came through. $52,000 at Cartier. He wasn't buying a mourning brooch. He was buying a diamond engagement ring for his mistress, while his wife was still warm in her hospital bed. I hovered my finger over the decline button. It would be so easy to shut him down right now, to embarrass him in front of the sales clerk and the woman he was trying to impress. But that would be petty. I didn't want him embarrassed. I wanted him buried. I let the transaction go through. The screen flashed approved. I imagined him standing there, that smug grin plastered on his face, flashing the black corporate American Express card like it was a magic wand. He had no idea that 20 minutes ago he had signed a document transferring all corporate liability to himself personally. That $50,000 wasn't coming out of a company slush fund anymore. It was coming out of his future. He was essentially borrowing money from me to buy jewelry for his whore, and he was personally guaranteeing the loan with assets he no longer had. He was financing his own destruction with an interest rate that would make a loan shark blush. I pulled up the audio feed from the listening device I had Cole plant in the Porsche while Brett was inside the hospital acting out his little tragedy. The audio quality was crystal clear. I heard the rustle of shopping bags and the sound of a velvet box snapping open. Vanessa squealed. It was a high, piercing sound of pure greed. She asked him if he was crazy spending this kind of money right now with everything going on. Brett laughed. He told her, "Baby, this is pocket change compared to what is coming." He told her that he had just duped the old man into handing over the keys to the kingdom. He said Conrad is so out of it, he practically thanked me for taking his money. By next week, I will be the king of this city. We will buy a bigger boat. We will buy a place in the hills. The world is ours. I sat in the dark conference room staring at the transaction log on my phone. A cold smile spread across my face. King of the city. He was about to be the king of absolutely nothing. I whispered to the empty room, "Go ahead, son. Buy the ring. Buy the watch. Buy the whole damn store. Every penny you spend is just another link in the heavy chain I am wrapping around your neck. You think you are spending my money, but you are spending your life. And the bill collector is coming a lot sooner than you think." Night descended on the Pacific Coast Highway, but the lights at the Malibu villa were blazing. Through the remote access of the security cameras on my iPad, I watched my son-in-law turn my daughter's sanctuary into a circus. He had sent out a blast email to his investors and social circle calling it a prayer vigil for Lily, but looking at the live feed, it looked a lot more like a coronation. There were caterers passing around lobster tails on silver trays. There was a DJ playing low ambient house music near the infinity pool. And there was Vanessa wearing a dress that was entirely inappropriate for a grieving friend standing by his side, as if she were already the lady of the house shaking hands with the board members of TechWave. I watched Brett gesture grandly at the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, telling a group of venture capitalists how he had designed this place himself. I heard him through the audio feed bragging about how he had poured his blood and sweat into acquiring this prime real estate. The lie was so smooth it almost impressed me. I remembered the day I bought that house clearly. I remembered sitting in the title office writing a cashier's check for $4.5 million in cash because Lily wanted to hear the ocean when she slept. I remembered handing the keys to Brett and seeing the envy in his eyes masked by a thin veneer of gratitude. He hadn't paid a dime. He hadn't hammered a single nail. He was a squatter with an ego problem, and tonight he was hosting a victory party on borrowed land. I turned off the monitor. I had seen enough. It was time to shed the skin of the grieving, helpless father from Ohio. I walked into the bedroom of the hotel suite where my team had laid out my armor. I took off the flannel pajamas and the worn-out trench coat that I had worn to the hospital. I put on a crisp white shirt with French cuffs. I tied a silk tie with a Windsor knot, tight and precise. I slipped into a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than Brett's car. I fastened my platinum cufflinks. When I looked in the mirror, the old confused farmer was gone. In his place stood Conrad Sullivan, the man who ate competitors for lunch and built skylines out of sheer will. I walked out to the hotel entrance. Liam O'Malley was waiting by the curb, checking his watch. Behind him stood 4 men who looked like linebackers in suits, my personal security detail. And in front of them, gleaming under the streetlights like a black shark, was my Rolls-Royce Phantom. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Liam opened the back door. I slid into the leather seat. The heavy door closed with a solid thud, sealing me in silence. I looked out the window as the car began to move toward Malibu. Brett Walsh wanted to be a big shot. He wanted to play in the big leagues. Tonight, I was going to show him exactly what happens when a minnow tries to swim with a leviathan. 0 hour had arrived. The Rolls-Royce glided up the winding driveway of the Malibu estate like a silent predator. Through the tinted windows, I could see the glow of the party spilling out onto the terrace. It was a grotesque display, a so-called vigil that looked more like a Vanity Fair after-party. I stepped out of the car, buttoning my jacket. The air smelled of sea salt and hubris. I signaled to the head of my security detail, a man named Kane who was the size of a vending machine and twice as hard. He nodded and spoke into his earpiece. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with artificial grief. I walked through the open French doors just as Brett tapped a crystal glass with a spoon. The DJ lowered the music to a respectful hum. Brett stood on a raised platform by the pool, bathed in the soft glow of the landscape lighting. He held a microphone in one hand and a glass of scotch in the other. He looked every inch the grieving, tragic hero. He cleared his throat, and his voice boomed across the patio. He said, "Friends, thank you for being here in this dark hour. Lily was the light of my life. She was my soulmate. And even though she is slipping away from us tonight, I know she would want us to be together. She would want us to celebrate the love we shared." He wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. Vanessa, standing in the front row, looked up at him with adoring eyes, her hand resting on her stomach, as if she were carrying the next heir to the throne. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker. A hard cut. The music died instantly, leaving only the sound of the crashing waves below. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. A moment later, the emergency floodlights I had installed years ago blazed to life, bathing the entrance in blinding white light. I stepped into the beam. I wasn't hunched over. I wasn't shuffling. I walked with the stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Liam O'Malley walked on my right, holding a leather briefcase like a weapon. 4 armed security guards in matching black suits flanked us, forming a phalanx of intimidation that cleared a path through the stunned guests. The crowd parted instantly. The investors, the models, the hangers-on, they all stepped back, their drinks forgotten in their hands. They sensed the shift in power. They smelled the danger. I locked eyes with Brett across the pool. His mouth hung open. The glass of scotch slipped from his fingers and shattered on the travertine tiles. He looked at my suit. He looked at my eyes. And for the first time, he saw the real me. The confusion on his face curdled into rage. He was embarrassed in front of his audience. He marched to the edge of the platform, his face twisting into a snarl. He shouted into the dead silence, his voice cracking with indignation. "Dad, what the hell are you doing? You are ruining the vigil. Get out of here. This is my house and you are trespassing." I didn't stop walking. I didn't blink. I just kept moving toward him, my eyes fixed on his throat, waiting for the moment to close the trap. He thought it was his house. He thought he was in charge. He was about to find out that he was just a guest who had overstayed his welcome by about 3 years. I didn't stop until I was standing toe-to-toe with him on that raised platform. Up close, I could see the sweat beading on his forehead and the way his eyes darted nervously to the security guards flanking the pool. He tried to puff out his chest to intimidate me, but he just looked like a child wearing his father's clothes. I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. He didn't even fight me for it. He was too paralyzed by confusion and the sudden realization that the dynamic had shifted violently against him. I tapped the microphone once, a dull thud that echoed through the silent garden. I looked out at the sea of faces, the investors, the models, the social climbers who were drinking my wine and eating my food. I spoke calmly, my voice amplified and crystal clear. I said, "You are right, Brett. This is a beautiful house. It is a masterpiece of modern architecture. But you made one small mistake in your speech. You forgot to mention who actually owns it." I nodded to Liam O'Malley. Liam stepped into the spotlight with the grace of an executioner. He placed his leather briefcase on a high cocktail table and snapped the brass locks open. The sound was like a gunshot in a library. He pulled out a single document, the same one Brett had scribbled his signature on just hours ago in the hospital waiting room. Liam didn't need a microphone. His voice was trained for courtrooms, and it carried to the back of the terrace. He announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, contrary to Mr. Walsh's claims, this property located at 24 Malibu Colony Road is the sole asset of the Lily Sullivan Revocable Trust. It is not, and has never been, the property of Brett Walsh." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Brett turned pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He stammered that it was a lie, that his name was on the deed. Liam ignored him and continued reading from the document. Furthermore, as of 9:15 this morning, Mr. Walsh voluntarily signed a spousal waiver of residency and asset claim. By his own hand, he relinquished all rights to occupy this domicile, effective immediately. Liam looked up from the paper and stared directly at Brett. "This is a formal notice to vacate. You are currently trespassing on private property. You have exactly 30 minutes to remove your personal effects and leave the premises before I authorize security to physically remove you." The silence that followed was absolute. The guests looked from me to Brett, waiting for him to laugh, waiting for him to produce a deed to prove us wrong. But Brett just stood there, freezing in the spotlight. He looked at the paper in Liam's hand, and I saw the memory crash into him. The hospital, the stack of papers, the gold pen, the arrogance that made him sign without reading. He realized in that moment that his greed had been the weapon I used to gut him. He had signed away his home because he was too busy counting his inheritance. Vanessa let out a small gasp and took a step away from him, instinctively distancing herself from the failure. The investors who had been shaking his hand minutes ago began to check their phones and look for the exit. The illusion of the successful tech mogul had shattered, leaving behind only a fraud in a rented suit. I leaned into the microphone one last time and whispered so only Brett and the front row could hear. "I told you I would handle the administration, son. Tick-tock. You have 29 minutes left." Brett tried to speak. He opened his mouth to spin another lie, to tell his investors that this was just a senile delusion or a cruel prank. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, trying to regain control of the narrative. But I didn't give him the chance. I wasn't just here to take back a house. I was here to burn his reputation to the ground. I pointed a small remote control at the massive LED screen mounted behind the DJ booth. It had been cycling through a slideshow of Lily's photos, a prop for his performance of grief. I pressed a single button. The image of my daughter's smiling face vanished. The screen flickered once and then exploded into high-definition video. It was the footage from the yacht recorded less than 24 hours ago. The audio wasn't whisper quiet anymore. It was pumped through the concert-grade sound system, echoing off the canyon walls and booming into the ears of every single person in the garden. Brett's voice, drunk and arrogant, filled the air. It was loud enough to be heard in the next county. "My wife is done," the voice on the screen declared, followed by the clinking of crystal glasses. "By sunrise, I will be a widower, and by next Friday, I will be $10 million richer." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the garden. On the screen, the digital Brett laughed and pointed a finger at the camera, oblivious to his future. "And that old fool Conrad in Ohio, he won't suspect a thing. I will tell him it was a tragedy. I will cry at the funeral, and then I will cash the check." The real Brett stood frozen on the stage, his face bathed in the glow of his own confession. He looked at the screen, and then he looked at the crowd. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting in the heat. The investors who had been ready to hand him millions stared at him with a mixture of horror and disgust. The socialites who had been drinking his wine slowly set their glasses down on the tables, as if the liquid had suddenly turned to poison. Vanessa let out a strangled cry. She saw herself on the enormous screen hanging onto Brett's arm, laughing about my daughter's murder. She realized in an instant that her modeling career, her social standing, and her future were incinerating in real time. She looked around wildly like a trapped animal. She kicked off her high heels and bolted toward the side gate, trying to escape the judgment of the crowd. But she didn't make it 3 steps. Kane, my head of security, stepped into her path. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. He just stood there, a wall of immovable muscle in a black suit. She backed away, trembling, her hands covering her face, trying to hide from the glare of the screen. The shock in the crowd turned into something uglier. Anger. These were people who lived and died by their reputations, and Brett had just implicated them in his filth. The phones came out. Not just one or two, but dozens of them. A sea of glowing rectangles rose in the darkness. The little red recording lights blinked like accusing eyes. They weren't just watching anymore. They were broadcasting. They were live streaming his downfall to Instagram, to TikTok, to the entire world. The booing started low at first, a rumble of disapproval from the back, but it grew quickly into a roar of condemnation. "Get him out of here," someone shouted. "Monster," a woman screamed. Brett Walsh was no longer the grieving husband. He was the most hated man in Los Angeles, and the show was just getting started. The humiliation on the screen was just the opening act. The main event was happening in his pocket. Brett's phone began to vibrate against his leg. It wasn't a call. It was a barrage of notifications, a relentless digital assault that buzzed every 3 seconds like an angry hornet. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled it out. I watched from the shadows as his eyes widened in disbelief. He swiped the screen. Notification 1. American Express Centurion card declined. Notification 2. Chase private client account frozen due to suspicious activity. Notification 3. The lease on the Porsche 911 has been terminated for breach of contract. He looked up at me, his face a mask of pure panic. He tried to unlock his banking app. I knew exactly what he was seeing because I had authorized the freeze orders myself 10 minutes ago. He was seeing red letters. He was seeing access denied. He was seeing the number 0 where there used to be millions. He frantically tapped the screen trying to transfer funds from his offshore accounts. But those were gone too. Liam had filed emergency injunctions in the Caymans based on the fraud evidence we uncovered. The pipes were cut. The well was dry. But I wasn't done. I pulled my own phone from my pocket and pressed send on a scheduled email. It went out to every single person on the guest list of this party. Every venture capitalist, every angel investor, every business partner standing on that lawn heard a simultaneous ping. It was a synchronized sound that cut through the murmur of the crowd. I watched as heads bowed. I watched as screens lit up. The subject line read, "TechWave Forensic Audit and Evidence of Embezzlement." A tall man in a gray suit near the front stepped forward. It was Mark, calculating the lead investor for Brett's upcoming funding round. Mark read the email. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He looked up at Brett, and the friendship in his eyes evaporated instantly, replaced by the cold fury of a man who realized he had been conned. He shouted across the pool, "Brett, is this true? Did you cook the books? Where is the capital from the Series A round?" The crowd turned. The mood shifted from shock to hostility in a heartbeat. They weren't just onlookers anymore. They were victims. They surrounded the stage like a pack of wolves closing in on a wounded deer. Another investor shouted about his quarterly returns. A third demanded to know why the solvency report showed a deficit of $8 million. They waved their phones in the air, demanding answers, demanding money, demanding blood. Brett backed away, his hands raised in a pathetic surrender. He stammered. He tried to say it was a misunderstanding. He tried to blame the accountants. But no one was listening. He grabbed his phone again, desperately dialing his private banker. I could see him screaming into the device, but I knew no one would answer. I had spoken to the bank president myself. Brett Walsh was radioactive. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the red icon. He realized in that terrifying moment that he couldn't buy a pack of gum, let alone a way out of this mess. It had taken him 3 years to build his lie. It took me exactly 15 minutes to strip him down to nothing but the suit on his back, and even that was probably least. Brett realized the walls were closing in, and his survival instinct finally overrode his arrogance. He didn't say goodbye to his guests. He didn't check on his crying mistress. He turned and sprinted toward the driveway, shoving past a waiter and knocking a tray of champagne flutes onto the concrete. He was running for this Porsche 911 GT3. It was his last symbol of power, his getaway vehicle. He reached into his pocket for the keys, his eyes wild with the desperation of a fugitive. He probably thought if he could just get to the highway, he could outrun the debt. He could outrun the shame. But he forgot that I play chess while he plays checkers. As he rounded the corner of the fountain, the sound of a diesel engine roared to life. It wasn't the purr of a German sports car. It was the grinding chug of a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck. The truck was already positioned, blocking the exit. The hydraulic arm was extended, and the hook was already attached to the rear axle of the Porsche. Brett screamed. He lunged at the driver, a man the size of a mountain, wearing a reflective vest that read Asset Recovery Team. Brett shouted that this was theft. He screamed that he was calling the police. The driver didn't even blink. He reached into his cab and pulled out a clipboard. He handed a yellow carbon copy to Brett, shoving it against his chest. He said, "Mr. Walsh, this vehicle is the property of TechWave Corporate Leasing. We received a notification at 5:01 p.m. that the primary leaseholder has been terminated for cause and the company is liquidating all executive assets immediately. We are repossessing the vehicle." Terminated. The word hung in the humid night air like a guillotine blade. Brett looked at the paper. It was a notice of termination signed by the new majority shareholder of TechWave. Me. He wasn't just losing the car. He was losing the title of CEO. He was losing his salary. He was losing his identity. He watched helplessly as the winch tightened. The Porsche was lifted into the air, its tires spinning uselessly in the void. It was loaded onto the flatbed like a piece of scrap metal. The driver climbed back into the cab, released the air brakes with a sharp hiss, and drove away, taking Brett's last shred of dignity with him down the Pacific Coast Highway. Brett stood there in the middle of the driveway. Behind him, the gates to the mansion were being locked by my security team. In front of him, the taillights of the tow truck were fading into the night. He checked his pockets but realized his phone was dead or disabled. He had no keys. He had no wallet that worked. He had no home. He was stranded in a tuxedo he probably couldn't afford to dry clean anymore. And then he noticed the light. It wasn't the moon. It was the flash of 100 smartphones. The guests had followed him out. They formed a tight ring around him, filming every second of his misery. They weren't cheering anymore. They were documenting the fall of Rome. He spun around, looking for a friendly face, but found only camera lenses and mocking smiles. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, and the whole world was watching him scream into the darkness. Brett turned his head, searching frantically for the one person he thought was still on his side. He found Vanessa standing near the edge of the circle of onlookers. She wasn't running anymore. She was watching him with a look of cold calculation that mirrored my own. She looked at the empty driveway where the Porsche used to be. She looked at the darkened mansion that was no longer his. And then she looked at the furious crowd live-streaming the entire debacle. I could practically see the gears turning in her head. She realized that Brett wasn't a golden ticket anymore. He was an anchor dragging her down to the bottom of the ocean. She made her decision instantly. She didn't offer him a hand. She didn't offer him comfort. She smoothed her dress, fixed her hair, and stepped into the center of the ring like an actress taking the stage for her final monologue. Brett reached out to her, his hands trembling. He whimpered her name, begging for a shred of support. He said, "Baby, please tell them. Tell them we are in love. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding." Vanessa's face twisted into a mask of pure outrage. She slapped him. It wasn't a gentle slap. It was a full-swing, open palm strike that cracked across his face like a whip. The sound silenced the murmuring crowd. Brett stumbled back, clutching his cheek, looking at her with total betrayal. Vanessa screamed at the top of her lungs, making sure every phone microphone picked up her words. She shouted, "Don't you dare touch me, you liar! You told me she was already dead. You told me you were a widower." She turned to the crowd, tears streaming down her face on command. She pointed a shaking finger at him. She yelled that he had manipulated her. She claimed he had forced her to come here. She said she was terrified of him and that she didn't know anything about the pills or the poisoning. It was a lie, of course. I had the recordings of her laughing about the murder on the yacht. I had the receipts of her helping him spend the money. But in that moment, she didn't care about the truth. She cared about survival. She was throwing him to the wolves to save her own skin. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a deal. She screamed, "I am a victim here too. He promised me a career, but he is just a monster." Brett fell to his knees. The physical blow hurt, but the emotional severance was fatal. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for, the woman he had committed murder for, was now standing over him, rewriting history to paint him as the villain and herself as the innocent prey. He was completely and utterly alone. He looked at the ground, his shoulders shaking, not with anger, but with the sobbing of a broken child. I walked through the crowd, which parted for me like the Red Sea. I stopped in front of him. My shadow fell over his kneeling form. I looked down at the top of his head. I didn't feel pity. I felt the cold satisfaction of a job well done. I spoke quietly, but in the silence of the driveway my voice carried like a bell. I said, "Look around you, Brett. The house is gone. The car is gone. The money is gone. The mistress is gone. You have nothing. You are nothing." He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. He whispered, "I have lost everything." I smiled a terrifying smile that didn't reach my eyes. I shook my head slowly. I told him, "No, son. You haven't lost everything yet. You think this is the bottom, but you are still falling. You see, I have one more surprise for you, and trust me, it is the best part." I raised my hand and signaled to Liam, who was standing by the large outdoor screen that was still glowing in the garden. It was time for the final reveal. I signaled to Liam, who was standing by the control booth. He tapped his tablet screen. The giant LED display behind us flickered. The image of the yacht and the damning subtitles vanished. For a second, the screen went black, and the only sound was the distant crashing of the ocean waves. The crowd held its breath, expecting another piece of evidence, another financial record, or perhaps a mugshot. But what appeared next was far more terrifying for the man kneeling in the driveway. The screen lit up with a live video feed. The connection was a little grainy at first, pixelating under the strain of the cellular network, but then it sharpened. It was a view from a hospital room, the same sterile room I had left hours ago. The beep of the heart monitor provided a steady, rhythmic soundtrack. In the center of the frame lay a figure in a bed, but she wasn't lying flat anymore. The head of the bed had been raised. Brett squinted at the screen, his eyes adjusting to the brightness. He let out a sound that was half whimper, half gasp. The figure on the screen moved. Slowly, painfully, the woman in the bed turned her head toward the camera lens. Her head was still wrapped in bandages, and her face was pale as moonlight, but her eyes were open. They were wide open, and they were burning with a fire that no sedative could extinguish. It was Lily, my daughter. The woman Brett had just told everyone was dead. The woman whose life insurance he had already spent in his mind. She was alive. She was awake. And she was looking right at him. Brett tried to stand up, but his legs refused to work. He scrambled backward on his hands and feet, like a crab trying to escape the tide. He pointed a shaking finger at the screen, his mouth working silently, unable to form words. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. In a way, he was. He was seeing the ghost of his future coming back to haunt him. I walked over to the microphone stand and tilted it toward the screen so her voice would be amplified. I said, "Go ahead, Lily. He is listening. The entire city is listening." Lily took a breath. It rattled in her chest, but her voice when it came was steady. It was the voice of a Sullivan. She looked directly into the camera lens bridging the miles between the hospital and the Malibu hills. She said, "Hello, Brett. I am not dead. I didn't die when you switched my pills. I didn't die when you refused to pay for my surgery. And I didn't die tonight." The crowd erupted in shock. People covered their mouths. This wasn't just a financial crime anymore. This was a resurrection. Lily continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. She said, "I have been watching the live stream, Brett. I saw you drinking champagne. I saw you with her. I heard what you said on the boat. I heard you call me a vegetable. Well, I have news for you. I remember everything. I remember the bitter taste of the coffee you made me every morning. I remember how you smiled when I said I felt dizzy. I remember it all." Brett collapsed. His arms gave out and his face hit the asphalt. He curled into a fetal position, letting out a primal scream of despair. He wasn't crying because he was sorry. He was screaming because he knew the math. Attempted murder, insurance fraud, spousal abuse. And the witness was the victim herself. He wasn't going to get a settlement. He wasn't going to get a plea deal. He was going to spend the rest of his natural life in a cage. And as he lay there sobbing in the dirt, I looked at my daughter on the screen and nodded. The trap was sprung. The rat was caught. And the end was finally here. The silence that followed Lily's voice on the screen was shattered by a sound I had been waiting for all night. Sirens. They started as a distant wail winding their way up the canyon roads, but within seconds they were a deafening crescendo. The darkness of the Malibu hills was suddenly pierced by a chaotic strobe of red and blue lights. It wasn't just one patrol car. It was a caravan. I watched as 6 LAPD cruisers screeched to a halt in the driveway, blocking the tow truck that had just left. Doors flew open, and officers poured out their hands resting on their holsters, moving with the precision of a SWAT team. At the head of the formation walked a man I knew well. Chief of Police Robert Miller. We had played poker together every third Saturday for 20 years back when I was still building factories. I had called him personally from the plane before I even landed in Los Angeles. Miller didn't look like a poker buddy tonight. He looked like the iron fist of the law. He marched past the stunned guests who parted for him like frightened sheep. He walked straight up to where Brett was curled on the ground, sobbing into the asphalt. 2 officers grabbed Brett by the arms and hauled him to his feet. His legs were like jelly. He couldn't stand on his own, so they held him up, dragging the toes of his expensive Italian loafers against the concrete. He looked at Miller with wild, frantic eyes. He started babbling. He said, "Officer, thank God you are here. These people are crazy. My father-in-law has gone insane. He is holding me hostage. He stole my car. You have to arrest him." Miller didn't even blink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, letting the gravity of the moment settle. He spoke in a voice that was low and hard like granite. He said, "Brett Walsh, I have a warrant here for your arrest. You are being charged with the attempted first-degree murder of Lily Sullivan Walsh. You are also charged with 14 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of insurance fraud, and falsifying medical records." Brett shook his head violently. He screamed that it was a lie. He screamed that we had no proof. He yelled about his rights. He shouted that he was being framed by a vindictive old man. Miller sighed. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was a small orange prescription bottle. It wasn't a pharmacy bottle. It was unlabeled. Miller held it up so the camera lights caught the reflection. He said, "We executed a search warrant on your vehicle 10 minutes ago based on a tip from a private investigator named Cole. We found this hidden inside the lining of your Callaway golf bag in the trunk of the Porsche before it was towed. The lab has already done a preliminary field test. It contains pure concentrated benzodiazepines, the same drug found in your wife's blood. Brett stared at the bottle. The fight went out of him instantly. His jaw went slack. He remembered hiding it there. He remembered thinking it was the perfect hiding spot because Lily never touched his golf clubs. He realized that Cole, the man I had hired, had been tearing his life apart while he was busy drinking champagne. The evidence was physical. It was undeniable. And it was in the hands of the chief of police. Miller nodded to his officers. He said, "Book him. Get this piece of garbage out of my sight." The officers spun Brett around. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the sweetest music I had ever heard. Click, click, click. It was the sound of a steel door slamming shut on his future. Brett didn't scream anymore. He just hung his head, defeated, broken, and finally recognizing the magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to kill a Sullivan, and now he was going to be buried by one. The cold steel of the handcuffs seemed to snap something inside Brett's mind. As the reality of the situation crashed down on him, the facade of the charming businessman evaporated completely, leaving behind a cornered animal. He began to thrash violently against the grip of the officers, kicking his legs out and screaming until the veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He wasn't pleading anymore. He was accusing. He spun around to face the wall of smartphone cameras, his eyes wild and bloodshot, screaming that this was a setup. He yelled that I had planted the drugs. He yelled that I was a senile old man who was jealous of his success. He screamed that I had paid off the police and that this was a conspiracy to steal his company. It was a pathetic display of narcissism collapsing under the weight of truth. The crowd watched in stunned silence, recording every second of his disintegration. The man who had stood on that stage 20 minutes ago, lecturing them about love and loss, was now spitting foam and cursing at a grandfather. Chief Miller looked at me and raised an eyebrow, silently asking if I wanted him gagged. I shook my head. I wanted to hear him beg. But more importantly, I had one last message to deliver. A message that wasn't for the police or the press. It was just for him. I stepped forward into the chaos. I raised a hand and the officers holding Brett paused, tightening their grip, but allowing me to enter his personal space. I walked right up to him until I could smell the fear radiating off him. It smelled sour like sweat and ruin. He stopped screaming when he saw me. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and confusion, expecting me to strike him or yell back. I did neither. I leaned in close, my mouth inches from his ear, so that only he could hear the final nail being driven into his coffin. I whispered in a voice as cold as the grave. I said, "Listen to me closely, son, because this is the last thing you are going to hear from me. You are worried about prison. You are worried about the trial. But you are forgetting the paperwork you signed this morning. You signed an unconditional personal guarantee for your company's debt. And guess who bought that debt at 5 o'clock this morning? I did. I own every cent you owe." I felt him stiffen. The blood drained from his face. I continued my whisper, relentless and cruel. I said, "That means I am your creditor. I am going to garnish every penny you ever make. When you go to prison, you won't have a cent in your commissary account. You won't be able to buy a packet of ramen noodles. You won't be able to buy a bar of soap. You won't be able to pay for protection. You will be the poorest man in that cell block, and I will make sure of it. I will keep you destitute until the day you die." I pulled back and looked him in the eye. The defiance was gone. It was replaced by sheer terror. He realized that I hadn't just taken his freedom. I had taken his ability to survive. I had ensured that his life behind bars would be a hell of deprivation. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to plead, but no sound came out. He was broken. I nodded to Miller. "Take him away." The officers jerked Brett around and began dragging him toward the waiting cruisers. He didn't fight them this time. His legs dragged uselessly against the pavement, his expensive tuxedo jacket bunching up around his shoulders. The cameras flashed in a blinding staccato rhythm, documenting his walk of shame. The guests, the investors, the people he had tried to impress, they all watched him go. As the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car and slammed the door, I saw his face pressed against the glass one last time. He looked small. He looked trapped. And for the first time in 3 years, he looked exactly like what he was. A zero. The red taillights of the police cruisers disappeared around the bend of the canyon road, taking the noise and the drama with them. The silence that rushed back into the Malibu estate was deafening. It was the silence of a vacuum, where the air had been sucked out, leaving only the stunned faces of 100 uninvited guests. They stood there frozen around the pool, holding their half-empty glasses of expensive wine, unsure of what to do next. They looked at me with a mixture of awe and terror. To them, I was no longer the background character in Brett's life. I was the director who had just fired the lead actor and burned down the set. I walked to the center of the patio and picked up the microphone one last time. It felt heavy in my hand. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I simply said, "The party is over. You have 5 minutes to vacate my property. If anyone is still standing on this lawn at the 5-minute mark, my lawyers will be sending you an invoice for venue rental at the rate of $10,000 an hour." I checked my watch and looked up. The clock starts now. The effect was instantaneous. It was like watching a colony of ants when the rock is lifted. The socialites, the investors, the influencers, they all scrambled for the exit. There were no goodbyes, no thank yous, just the sound of high heels clicking frantically on the pavement and the roar of engines starting up in the driveway. They left their drinks on the tables. They left their dignity at the door. Within 4 minutes, the estate was empty. The parasites had found a new host to feed on, leaving me alone with my security team and the lingering smell of betrayal. I turned to Kane, my head of security. I pointed toward the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, the room with the balcony overlooking the ocean. I said, "Kane, I want everything gone. Go into the closet. Take his suits. Take his shoes. Take the watches he bought with my money. Take Vanessa's dresses. Take the sheets off the bed. I want every single molecule of Brett Walsh removed from this house. Do not pack it in boxes. Bring it down here." Kane nodded, understanding the assignment perfectly. For the next 20 minutes, my security team worked like a demolition crew. They marched out of the house carrying armfuls of Italian silk suits, designer handbags, and cashmere sweaters. They threw them into a heap on the marble deck of the infinity pool. It was a mountain of luxury, a pile of greed. I saw the white linen suit he had worn on the yacht. I saw the dress Vanessa had worn to the vigil. It all looked like garbage now. I grabbed a bottle of lighter fluid from the outdoor kitchen. I walked over to the pile and doused it generously. The smell of the chemical mixed with the faint scent of expensive cologne. I pulled a silver Zippo lighter from my pocket, flipped the lid, and struck the flint. The flame danced in the wind for a second, before I tossed it onto the clothes. Whoosh! The fire roared to life, eating through the silk and the lies with equal veracity. I stood there watching the orange flames lick at the night sky. The heat was intense on my face, but I didn't step back. I watched the smoke rise, carrying away the last 3 years of my daughter's misery. I watched the symbols of Brett's status turn to ash and black carbon. It was a cleansing. It was an exorcism. I turned my back on the fire, leaving the embers to glow in the darkness. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the private line at the ICU. Dr. Aris answered on the first ring. I looked out at the dark ocean, the sound of the waves finally bringing me a sense of peace. I said, "Doctor, it is Conrad. I am done here. The trash has been taken out. Keep the lights on for me. I am coming home to my daughter." The transition from the manicured lawns of Malibu to the holding cell at the men's central jail in downtown Los Angeles is a shock that breaks stronger men than Brett Walsh. He was processed like common trash. They took his Tom Ford suit and replaced it with a bright orange jumpsuit that smelled of industrial detergent and other men's sweat. They took his platinum watch. They took his dignity. And then they threw him into a 6-by-8-foot cage with a stainless steel toilet and a bench that was colder than ice. For the first hour, he paced the cell like a caged tiger. He was still running on adrenaline and entitlement. He demanded his phone call. He screamed at the guards that he knew judges. He screamed that this was a mistake. When they finally let him use the wall phone, he dialed the number of his high-priced defense attorney. It rang, and rang, and rang. It went to voicemail. He dialed again. Same result. He called his backup firm. The receptionist answered, heard his name, and immediately hung up. He didn't know that 3 hours earlier, while he was busy partying on the yacht, Liam O'Malley had sent a quiet memo to every major criminal defense firm in the city. The memo didn't make threats. It simply stated that any firm representing Brett Walsh would find themselves facing a conflict of interest audit from Sullivan Industrial regarding their real estate holdings. In Los Angeles, money talks, but power screams. No one was going to touch him. He was radioactive. He was standing there holding the receiver, hearing the dial tone, realizing that the silence on the other end was the sound of his social exile. He slumped down on the concrete bench, his head in his hands. He was alone. Truly alone. Then the slot in the heavy steel door slid open. A guard's eyes appeared. He didn't offer a sandwich or water. He slid a thin manila envelope through the slot. It fluttered to the floor, landing by Brett's feet. Brett stared at it. Hope flared in his chest. A lawyer. It had to be a lawyer. Maybe a public defender. Maybe someone had seen the news and wanted the case for the publicity. He scrambled to his knees and tore the envelope open, his hands shaking so hard he almost ripped the paper inside. He pulled out the document. It wasn't a writ of habeas corpus. It wasn't a bail offer. It was an invoice. It was printed on the letterhead of CS Holdings. I had instructed Liam to prepare it before we even left the hospital. The itemization was brutal in its pettiness. Line 1. 1 bottle of Dom Perignon vintage champagne consumed at Marina del Rey. Cost $300. Line 2. Fuel surcharge for unauthorized use of marine vessel. Cost $12,000. Line 3. Cleaning fee for biological contamination of yacht deck. $500. Stapled to the invoice was a yellow sticky note with my handwriting on it. I had written it in the car on the way to the party. It read simply, "A payment due upon receipt. Since your assets are frozen and your accounts are empty, you are in default. The current exchange rate for prison labor is 60 cents an hour. You owe me $12,800. By my calculation, that is roughly 21,000 hours of scrubbing toilets. Better get started, son." Brett stared at the paper. The absurdity of it hit him like a physical blow. He was facing life in prison for attempted murder, and I was billing him for the champagne he drank while celebrating it. It was the ultimate insult. It was my way of telling him that I owned him completely. Even in here, he was on my clock. He looked at the bill, and then he looked at the dirty walls of the cell. The reality of his future crashed down on him. He wasn't going to be the king of the city. He was going to be the janitor of the cell block for the next 3 lifetimes. A sound started deep in his throat, a low, guttural moan that rose in pitch until it became a scream. He crumpled the invoice in his fist and hurled it at the wall. He threw his head back and howled a raw, animalistic sound of pure despair that echoed down the concrete hallway, bouncing off the bars and the indifferent faces of the other inmates. He screamed until his voice gave out. He screamed because he finally understood. The party was over. The check had arrived, and he couldn't pay. The drive back to Cedars-Sinai was quiet. The rage that had fueled me for the last 24 hours had burned itself out, leaving behind a deep exhaustion and a desperate need to see my child. I walked through the hospital corridors, which were hushed now in the early hours of the morning. The nurses at the station didn't ask for my identification this time. They just nodded solemnly, respecting the father who had walked through fire to get back to this room. I pushed open the door to room 304. The lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow. The terrifying hiss of the ventilator was gone, replaced by the steady rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the soft sound of shallow breathing. Lily was awake. She was propped up against a mountain of pillows, her head still wrapped in thick bandages, her skin pale against the white sheets. But her eyes were open. Those same blue eyes that used to look up at me when I read her bedtime stories were now filled with a pain that had nothing to do with surgery. When she saw me, she didn't smile. Her face crumbled. A sob broke from her chest, a raw, wounded sound that tore my heart in two. She tried to reach out to me, but her arms were tangled in IV lines. I crossed the room in 2 strides and sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping my arms around her fragile frame. I held her as she wept, shaking with the force of her grief. She buried her face in my chest, soaking my shirt with her tears. Her voice was raspy from the tube that had been down her throat. She whispered, "I am so sorry, Dad. I am so sorry. I was so stupid. How could I be so blind? I let him in. I let him hurt me. I gave him everything you worked for. I am a fool." She was beating herself up, taking the blame for the crimes of a sociopath. She felt the shame of the victim, the terrible belief that she should have known better. I pulled back slightly and cupped her face in my large, rough hands. I forced her to look at me. I wiped the tears from her cheeks with my thumbs. I told her to stop. I said, "Lily, listen to me. This is not your fault. You are not stupid. You are kind. You have a heart that sees the best in people. That is not a weakness. It is a gift. The fault is mine. I spent so much time teaching you how to read a balance sheet, how to negotiate a contract, and how to build a business. But I failed to teach you the most important thing. I didn't teach you how to spot a wolf in sheep's clothing. I didn't teach you that some people don't have souls. I let you believe the world was as good as you are. That is my failure, not yours." She looked at me, her lip trembling, the guilt slowly beginning to fade from her eyes, replaced by the comfort of my absolution. I kissed her forehead right next to the bandage. I whispered that it was over. I told her that the cancer had been cut out. I told her that Brett was gone and he was never coming back. I told her that I had taken care of everything. The house, the money, the company. It was all safe. I took her hand and squeezed it. I made her a promise in that quiet hospital room. I said, we are going to rebuild Lily. Not just the bank accounts, but you. I am going to build a fortress around you so strong that no one will ever hurt you again. You are a Sullivan. We don't break. We just get stronger. Now rest, my angel. Your old life is gone. When you wake up, we start building the new one. And this time we build it on your terms. She closed her eyes, her hand relaxing in mine, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept without fear. 6 months is a long time when you are living in a 6x8 concrete box. When the bailiffs led Brett Walsh into the Los Angeles Superior Court for the final sentencing hearing, he looked like he had aged 20 years. The golden tan that he used to cultivate so carefully on my yacht was gone, replaced by a sickly gray pallor that comes from never seeing the sun. His hair, once thick and perfectly styled with expensive product, was thinning and greasy. He had lost at least 30 pounds. The orange jumpsuit hung off his skeletal frame like a tent. He shuffled to the defense table in shackles, the heavy metal chains clinking against the floor, echoing in the silent courtroom. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the press. He stared at the wooden table, terrified of making eye contact with the reality he had created. The trial itself had been a massacre. It wasn't a legal battle, it was a public execution of his character. My lawyer, Liam, had handed the district attorney a silver platter piled high with evidence. The jury had watched the high-definition video from the yacht, showing his drunken confession. They had heard the crystal-clear audio recordings from the car, where he bragged about spending the insurance money. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't digital. It was flesh and blood. Vanessa. She walked to the witness stand wearing a modest navy blue dress and no makeup, looking like a repentant schoolteacher. She had cut a deal, full immunity in exchange for her testimony. She sat there under oath and painted Brett as the mastermind of a demonic plot. She claimed she was afraid of him. She claimed she tried to stop him but was terrified for her safety. It was a lie, of course. She was just as guilty as he was. But watching her point a finger at him while he sat there, betrayed by the only person he thought loved him, was a specific kind of justice. Brett looked at her with hollow, dead eyes, realizing that the loyalty of thieves expires the moment the handcuffs click shut. She didn't look at him once. She sold him out to save her own skin and walked out the side door, a free woman, leaving him to rot. The Honorable Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked down at Brett with pure disdain. The courtroom held its breath. I sat in the front row next to Lily, who was holding my hand so tightly her knuckles were white. She was healed now, the bandages gone, her hair growing back, but the scar on her soul would take longer to fade. The judge spoke clearly, his voice booming off the mahogany walls. He said, "Mr. Walsh, your actions display a level of depravity and calculation that shocks the conscience of this court. You didn't just try to kill your wife, you tried to erase her existence for profit, while she lay helpless in a hospital bed. For the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, combined with the sentencing enhancements for massive financial fraud and elder abuse, I am sentencing you to 25 years in the state penitentiary." 25 years. No parole. No early release for good behavior. The gavel banged down, a sound like a gunshot ending a war. Brett didn't scream this time. He didn't cry. He simply slumped forward, his forehead hitting the defense table with a dull thud. He knew what that sentence meant. He knew that by the time he saw the outside world again, his youth would be gone. His life would be over. The bailiffs hauled him up by his armpits. As they dragged him away, he looked back one last time. He saw Lily standing tall and healthy. And he saw me. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just nodded. The transaction was complete. The debt was paid, and the account was closed. They sent him to Ironwood. It isn't the worst prison in the state, but for a man like Brett Walsh, who was used to Egyptian cotton sheets and room service, it might as well be the deepest circle of hell. The reality of my promise hit him on his very first day. He marched up to the commissary window, hoping to buy a packet of ramen noodles, a bar of decent soap, or maybe a honey bun to trade for safety. He swiped his inmate ID card. The machine let out a harsh buzz. The guard behind the glass laughed and told him his balance was zero. Every time his parents tried to wire him $50, every time a sympathetic friend tried to send him a little cash, my legal team intercepted it immediately. The garnish order was absolute. Every single penny that entered his name went straight to me to pay off the interest on his $8 million debt. Without money in prison, you are not just poor. You are prey. Brett learned quickly that he couldn't buy protection. He couldn't buy friends. And in the violent ecosystem of the cell block, his crime made him a target. Convicts have a twisted code of honor. They respect bank robbers. They tolerate drug dealers. But they despise men who hurt women. The other inmates knew who he was. They knew he had tried to kill his wife for insurance money. They called him wife killer. They tripped him in the chow line. They spat in his food. He spent every waking moment looking over his shoulder, terrified and alone. His job assignment was the final humiliation. The man who used to act like a CEO was assigned to the sanitation crew, specifically the latrine detail. For 8 hours a day, Brett Walsh scrubbed the communal toilets of D Block. I received reports from my contact inside the prison. He told me Brett spent his days on his knees, hands gloved in rubber, choking on the fumes of industrial bleach and human waste. He was earning 60 cents an hour. And even that 60 cents was seized by the state and sent to my bank account. He was literally scrubbing toilets to pay me back for the champagne he drank on my yacht. But the physical torture wasn't what broke him. It was the television. One afternoon, about 3 months into his sentence, Brett was mopping the floor of the common room. The TV was bolted high on the wall, tuned to the local news. The inmates were ignoring it, playing cards or arguing. But then a familiar face appeared on the screen. It was Lily. She was standing at a podium cutting the ribbon for a new women's shelter she had funded with the proceeds from selling the Malibu house. She looked radiant. She was wearing a white power suit, her hair shining under the camera lights, her smile confident and genuine. The chyron on the bottom of the screen read, "Lily Sullivan, CEO of CS Holdings, launches new initiative." She looked strong. She looked powerful. She looked happy. Brett stopped mopping. He stared up at the screen at the woman he had tried to destroy. He watched the world celebrating her. He watched her thriving without him. The mop handle snapped in his hands. A guttural scream ripped from his throat. He threw the bucket across the room, splashing dirty water everywhere. He screamed at the television, clawing at the air, trying to tear her down from her pedestal. The other inmates just laughed at him. The guards tackled him and dragged him to solitary confinement. As he was dragged away, kicking and sobbing, he finally understood the true extent of his punishment. He wasn't just in prison. He was in a box, watching the world move on and realizing that he was completely, utterly forgotten. The destruction of his mind was complete. The physical scars on Lily's head faded quickly, hidden beneath a stylish new bob cut that framed her face with a sharpness she had never possessed before. But the internal changes were far more permanent. I watched my daughter come back to life, but she didn't come back as the soft-spoken yoga instructor who trusted everyone with an open heart. She came back as a warrior who had survived the fire and forged herself into steel. She spent weeks in physical therapy, pushing her body to its limits, refusing to take painkillers, refusing to show weakness. And when the doctors finally cleared her for work, she didn't go back to the yoga studio. She came to my office at CS Holdings. I remember the day she walked into the boardroom. The room was filled with gray-haired executives, men who had worked for me for 30 years, men who thought they could pat her on the head and run the company for her. Lily walked in wearing a tailored black suit that cost more than their cars. She didn't sit at the side of the table. She walked straight to the head of the table, the chair that had been empty since I retired. She sat down, opened a leather portfolio, and began the meeting without even saying hello. She tore apart the quarterly projections with a surgical precision that made the CFO sweat. She fired the vice president of marketing on the spot for mediocrity. In 1 hour, she proved to everyone in that room that she wasn't just Conrad Sullivan's daughter. She was Conrad Sullivan's upgrade. Her first official act as CEO was personal. She drove out to Malibu one last time. I went with her. The house was empty now, stripped of all the furniture and the lies that Brett had filled it with. It was just a hollow shell of glass and concrete overlooking the ocean. Lily walked through the empty rooms, her heels clicking on the travertine floors. She didn't cry. She didn't look nostalgic. She looked at the walls like a contractor assessing a demolition site. She turned to me and said, "Sell it, Dad. Sell it today. I don't care about the market conditions. Get rid of it." We sold the villa 48 hours later to a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley. We made a profit of $2 million. I asked Lily what she wanted to do with the money, expecting her to buy a new apartment or invest it in the market. She shook her head. She took every single cent of the sale, combined it with the insurance payout she had received from the fraud claim, and deposited it into a new trust. She launched the Sullivan Foundation for domestic abuse survivors. She told me that she wanted to build a safety net for women who were too blinded by love to see the knife coming. She used the money to fund legal teams for women trying to escape coercive marriages. She hired private investigators to help wives find hidden assets. She turned the wreckage of her marriage into a weapon to protect others. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. But as I watched her sign the papers, I noticed something else. The light in her eyes had changed. The warmth was still there for me, but for the rest of the world, there was a layer of ice. She didn't laugh as easily anymore. She didn't trust blindly. She analyzed. She calculated. She negotiated. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the world is full of wolves, and if you want to survive, you have to have sharper teeth than they do. I looked at my daughter, and for the first time I didn't see a victim. I saw a reflection of myself. She had become a shark, and God help anyone who tried to swim in her waters again. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the executive suite, looking out at the smoggy Los Angeles skyline one last time. For 40 years I had looked at cities like this as battlegrounds, places to conquer and build and dominate. But today, the view just looked like traffic and noise. I turned around and looked at Lily. She was sitting at my old mahogany desk, signing a stack of merger documents with a speed and confidence that terrified the lawyers standing around her. She didn't need my advice anymore. She didn't need my protection. She had become the storm that I used to be. I realized then that my watch had ended. I was just an old soldier standing in the way of the general. I cleared my throat and asked the lawyers to leave the room. When we were alone, I walked over to the desk and placed a small velvet box and a heavy set of keys on top of the paperwork. Lily looked up, her blue eyes sharp and questioning. She asked if I was going somewhere. I smiled and told her I was going home. Not to the hotel suite, not to the penthouse, but home to Ohio. I told her that the farm was calling me and that my tomato plants were probably dying without me. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the official resignation letter I had carried for a month. I signed it right there in front of her. I told her that CS Holdings was hers now. All of it. The assets, the liabilities, the power. I told her she was better at this than I ever was because she fought with a heart that had been broken and rebuilt while I just fought with an ego. She stood up and hugged me, and for a moment the shark skin vanished, and she was just my little girl again. She asked about the keys on the desk. She recognized the keychain. It belonged to the yacht. The Azure Dream. The boat where Brett had celebrated her death. Her face darkened. She told me she didn't want it. She said she wanted to burn it like we burned his clothes. I shook my head and told her to look closer. I told her that I had dry docked the vessel for the last month. I had the hull stripped and repainted. I had the interior gutted and replaced. And most importantly, I had the name changed. I told her that a Sullivan doesn't run from bad memories, we conquer them. We repurpose them. I told her the boat wasn't called the Azure Dream anymore. I handed her a photo of the new stern. Painted in gold letters was the name Phoenix. I told her it was fitting. It was a creature that rises from its own ashes, stronger and more beautiful than before. Just like her. I told her to take the boat out on the ocean and make new memories. Reclaim the water. Make it yours. I didn't stay for a long emotional goodbye. I walked out of the building with a single carry-on bag. I took a cab to the airport and flew commercial back to Columbus. When I finally pulled my truck into the gravel driveway of my farm, the silence of the countryside felt like a warm blanket. I changed into my overalls. I walked out to my garden and knelt in the dirt. I smelled the earth and the rain. I was just an old man growing vegetables again. But I smiled because I knew that thousands of miles away, a phoenix was rising and the world wasn't ready for her. The salt air felt different out here on the open water. It didn't smell like betrayal anymore. It didn't smell like old money and cheap perfume. It smelled clean. It smelled like freedom. I stood on the polished teak deck of the Phoenix, holding a glass of iced tea, watching the sun begin its slow descent into the Pacific. The water was a sheet of hammered gold stretching out to the horizon, calm and steady. It was hard to believe that exactly 365 days ago, this vessel was the scene of a crime. It was hard to believe that a year ago my daughter was lying in a hospital bed with tubes down her throat while her husband planned her funeral. I looked over at Lily. She was standing at the bow, her hands resting lightly on the railing. She wore a simple white linen dress that caught the ocean breeze billowing around her like a sail. She didn't look like the broken girl I had held in the ICU. She didn't look like the shark in the boardroom either. Out here, away from the noise of the city and the pressure of the company, she just looked like herself. But it was a version of herself I hadn't seen in years. She looked peaceful. The lines of tension that had defined her face during her marriage were smoothed away. Her shoulders were relaxed. She was breathing deep, drinking in the air, as if she couldn't get enough of it. I had flown in from Ohio yesterday just to be with her for this anniversary. I was worried that the date might trigger old wounds. I was worried she might be sad or angry or haunted by the ghost of the man who tried to kill her. But I was projecting my own fears. Lily wasn't haunted. She was healed. She turned her head and saw me watching her. A smile spread across her face, warm and genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes. She motioned for me to join her at the rail. I walked over and leaned against the warm wood next to her. We stood there in silence for a long time, watching a pod of dolphins break the surface in the distance. We didn't need to talk. We didn't need to discuss quarterly earnings or legal briefs or the letters Brett kept sending from prison that we burned unopened. We just shared the quiet understanding of two survivors who had fought a war and won. Lily reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small black velvet pouch. I knew immediately what was inside. It was the only piece of the past she hadn't destroyed yet. She loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. The platinum band glinted in the dying sunlight. The diamond was huge, flawless, and cold. It was the ring Brett had given her, the symbol of a promise that was a lie from the moment it was spoken. She held it up, inspecting it one last time. There was no anger in her movements. There was no shaking. She looked at it with the detachment of someone examining a strange rock found in a shoe. She said quietly, "I kept this because I thought I needed a reminder. I thought I needed to remember the pain so I would never be foolish again. But I realized something today, Dad. I don't need a trinket to remind me of who I am. I am not defined by what he did to me. I am defined by what I did after." She closed her fingers over the ring, making a fist. She pulled her arm back. She didn't throw it with rage. She threw it with relief. She launched it high into the air. We watched the diamond catch the light one last time, spinning end over end, a tiny falling star dropping into the abyss. It hit the water with a barely audible splash and vanished. It was gone, buried under a billion gallons of salt water, sinking down to the dark, cold bottom where it belonged. Lily dusted her hands off as if she had just finished a chore. She turned to me and linked her arm through mine, resting her head on my shoulder. She whispered, "Happy anniversary, Dad." I squeezed her arm tight. The anchor was cut. The past was at the bottom of the sea. And the Phoenix was finally free to fly. The sun is setting over the cornfields, now painting the sky in shades of purple and bruised orange. It is quiet here on the farm. The only sound is the rhythmic creak of my rocking chair on the wooden porch and the wind rustling through the stalks. It is a world away from the glass towers of Los Angeles. It is a world away from the cold steel bars of Ironwood Penitentiary. I look down at my hands. They are rough hands. They are the hands of a man who started digging in the dirt and ended up moving mountains. I have spent my entire life chasing the next deal, the next acquisition, the next zero in the bank account. People used to ask me why. They asked me how much was enough. They told me I couldn't take it with me when I die. They were missing the point. They look at wealth and they see luxury. They see fast cars and summer homes and vintage wine. They think money is about buying things to fill up the empty spaces in your life. But they are wrong. I look at those numbers on a spreadsheet, and I don't see toys. I see ammunition. I see walls I can build to keep the monsters out. I see weapons I can forge to hunt the monsters down. There is an old cliché that poor men use to comfort themselves when the world beats them down. They say money cannot buy happiness, and in a way they are right. All the gold in Fort Knox cannot fix a broken heart. It cannot cure cancer. It cannot make a lonely man feel loved. But let me tell you what money can buy. It buys options. It buys access. It buys the ability to pick up a phone at 3 in the morning and wake up the chief of police. It buys the power to freeze a man's life in its tracks. It buys justice when the law is too slow or too blind to provide it. Brett Walsh made the classic mistake. He looked at me and saw an old ATM machine. He saw a senile grandfather who would write checks and fade quietly into the background. He didn't understand that every dollar I earned over 40 years was a soldier waiting for orders. He didn't understand that I wasn't hoarding greed, I was stockpiling protection. When he hurt my daughter, he didn't just break a marriage vow. He declared war on a superpower. He thought he was playing a game, but he didn't know that I owned the board. I owned the pieces. I owned the table. And I owned the darkness he is now sitting in. I think about him sometimes. I think about him sitting in that 6x8 cell wearing shoes that don't fit, eating food that tastes like ash. He has 25 years to do the math. He has 25 years to realize that the cost of betrayal is always higher than the payout. And then I think about Lily. I think about her standing on the deck of the Phoenix, throwing that ring into the ocean. I think about the smile on her face that is finally hers again. That smile cost me millions of dollars in legal fees and debt acquisitions and private investigators. And it was the best bargain I ever found. Some people might call me a monster for what I did. They might say I was vindictive. They might say I took it too far. Let them talk. I sleep soundly at night. Because I know the truth about this world. It is full of wolves. And a father's job isn't to be nice. It isn't to be fair. A father's job is to be the wall between his child and the teeth of the world. Money might not buy happiness, but it buys choices. And if you touch my blood, I will use every cent I have to buy you a first-class ticket to hell. My name is Conrad Sullivan. And this is how I protect my family. The story of Conrad and Brett teaches us a powerful truth about the nature of strength. Real power is not about flashing money or shouting the loudest. It is about the quiet resolve to protect the ones you love at all costs. Brett made the fatal mistake of confusing kindness with weakness, and he learned too late that the most dangerous man in the room is often the one who says the least. It reminds us that while greed can build a house of cards, only integrity can build a home. Never underestimate a parent's love, because it is the only force on earth that can turn a tragedy into a victory. If you enjoyed seeing justice served cold, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories just like this one.